In the heart of the Arizona desert, a lonely widow discovers a wounded stranger bleeding by her fence. In a world where fear rules and bullets speak louder than words, she faces an impossible choice: turn away and stay safe, or offer water to Kay, her supposed enemy, and risk everything. What happens next will shatter decades of hatred and transform an entire valley forever. This is the story of how one woman's simple act of compassion sparked a revolution that no one saw coming. If you're ready for a tale that will restore your faith in humanity, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's dive into this extraordinary journey. The desert held its breath at dawn, and Clara McCallan had grown to understand that particular silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of everything unsaid, everything that had been buried beneath the red earth and forgotten by those who passed through without stopping to listen. She stood on the wooden porch of her ranch house, her weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had once belonged to her husband. The coffee inside had grown cold, but she held it anyway, feeling the familiar weight against her palms. The sun painted the landscape in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward her with desperate fingers. 52 years of living had taught Clara that grief was not a visitor that came and went. It was a room you learned to live in, rearranging the furniture until you could navigate around its sharp edges without bleeding. 3 years had passed. Since Robert's funeral, since the last neighbor had stopped bringing casseroles and asking how she was managing. The answer had always been the same: one day at a time, like walking across hot sand barefoot. The ranch sprawled across 40 acres of stubborn earth, where only the hardiest plants dared to take root. Palo Verde trees stood like sentinels, their green bark a defiant splash of life against the muted palette of survival. Clara had learned their names from Robert: Ocotillo, Cholla, Barrel Cactus, but it was only in solitude that she had begun to understand their language. Her morning routine was sacred in its simplicity: check the well, feed the 3 remaining horses, mend whatever the wind had broken during the night. The fence line required constant attention, not because it kept anything in, but because it kept the vastness from swallowing her whole. The nearest town, Mesquite Flats, lay 30 miles east, connected to her world by a dirt road that washboarded in summer and disappeared entirely during flash floods. The townspeople remembered her as Robert's wife, the quiet woman who had followed him to this unforgiving place and stayed even after he was gone. They spoke of her in hushed tones at the general store, wondering how long before the desert claimed her too. Clara had stopped going to town months ago. The weight of their pity had become heavier than the weight of her solitude. She tilted her head skyward, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high above. Robert had always said the hawks were messengers, though he'd never explained what messages they carried. Now, in the expanding silence of her days, Clara found herself listening for those messages, waiting for some sign that her life still held purpose beyond mere survival. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that made her pause: creosote, the smell of rain that hadn't fallen, the promise of change that never came. She drained the cold coffee and turned toward the house, her bare feet soundless against the wooden planks. Inside, the rooms held their breath too, filled with Robert's absence and her own careful movements around the spaces he had once occupied. His reading chair remained angled toward the window. His coffee cup sat unwashed in the sink, as if he might return at any moment to claim it. Clara had learned that love was not something you stopped feeling when someone died. It was something you carried differently, like water in cupped hands, careful not to spill what remained. The fence post leaned at an angle that spoke of surrender, and Clara approached it with the resignation of someone who had mended this particular section dozens of times before. The wire had snapped during the night, probably torn by a javelina or coyote passing through. But as she drew closer, her tools heavy in her hands, she noticed something that made her breath catch: blood. Dark stains on the barbed wire that were too fresh to be from any animal she knew. She set down her hammer and wire cutters, her eyes scanning the ground with new purpose. The tracks were barely visible in the hardpan, scuffed marks that suggested someone had passed this way recently, someone who was hurt and trying not to leave a trail. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the first whispers of heat that would soon make the desert floor shimmer like water. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and followed the faint signs, her heart beating, with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. It was the rhythm of being needed. 20 yards from the fence, partially hidden by a cluster of prickly pear cactus, she found him. He lay on his side, his long black hair spread across the red earth, like spilled ink. His clothes were torn and dust-covered, and blood had seeped through the fabric at his shoulder and side. But it was his face that stopped Clara's forward motion, the high cheekbones and weathered brown skin that spoke of heritage older than the Spanish missions, older than the mining claims and railroad surveys that had carved up this land. Apache. The word arrived in her mind with all the weight of inherited fear, stories told by neighbors and newspaper headlines that painted a picture of violence and savagery. But looking at him now, unconscious and vulnerable under the vast sky, Clara saw only a man who was hurt and far from help. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. A fever flushed his skin, and she could see where a bullet had grazed his shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to weaken him with blood loss and infection. For a long moment, Clara stood frozen between two worlds. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons she should walk away, should ride to town and let the sheriff handle whatever trouble had brought this man to her land. The townspeople would expect it. Robert, God rest his soul, probably would have expected it too. But there was another voice, quieter and deeper, that spoke of the woman she had been before grief had made her small, the woman who had once pulled drowning kittens from a flooded creek without thinking of the danger. The woman who had tended to Robert through his final illness with hands that knew healing more than they knew harm. She knelt beside the unconscious man, her knees sinking into the warm earth. Up close she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with a strong face that spoke of both gentleness and resolve. There was something about his hands, even. In unconsciousness, that suggested they were more familiar with creating than destroying. Clara touched his forehead, feeling the heat of fever burning beneath his skin. His breathing was labored, and she could see where dehydration had begun to hollow his cheeks. Whatever had brought him here, whoever was chasing him, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that he was dying. She looked back toward her house, calculating the distance and her own strength. He was not a small man, and she was not young. But she had dragged sick calves to shelter before, had pulled her injured husband from a fallen horse. The desert had taught her that survival often came down to what you were willing to carry. The hawk circled overhead, crying once before disappearing, into the blue vastness. Clara took it as a sign, though she couldn't say of what. Clara's hands trembled as she touched the stranger's wrist, feeling for the pulse that would tell her whether her choice mattered at all. The heartbeat fluttered beneath her fingers like a butterfly caught in cupped palms, fragile but present, alive. She sat back on her heels, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. To help him would mean defying not just the unspoken rules of her community, but the careful boundaries she had built around her own survival. For 3 years, she had existed in the space between the living and the dead, asking nothing of the world and expecting nothing in return. Now the world had delivered this broken man to her doorstep, and she could feel the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. The sun climbed higher, and she knew that soon the heat would make any movement dangerous, for both of them. If she was going to act, it had to be now. If she was going to walk away, it had to be now too. She thought of Robert, of the stories he had told about his grandfather who had fought in the Indian Wars, tales of brutality on both sides, of trust broken and blood spilled until the very ground seemed poisoned with grief. Robert had inherited those stories like heirlooms, polishing them with each retelling until they gleamed with the hard shine of absolute truth. But Robert had also been the man who left water at the property line for anyone passing through, who had never turned away a soul in need regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. She had loved him for that contradiction, the way he carried both fear and compassion in the same heart, without letting either consume the other. The Apache man stirred slightly, his lips moving soundlessly around words she couldn't understand. In his delirium, he seemed to be reaching for something, perhaps water, perhaps home, perhaps someone who loved him and was wondering why he hadn't returned. Clara made her choice the way she had learned to make all important decisions in the desert, not with her mind, but with the deep wisdom of her body that understood survival meant more than just keeping yourself alive. She stood and walked. Back to her house, her steps quickening with purpose. From the barn she retrieved a canvas tarp and the rope she used for hauling feed. The wheelbarrow was rusty but functional, and she lined it with old blankets that still smelled faintly of Robert's aftershave. The journey back to where the man lay seemed longer, the sun already beginning to press down with the promise of the furnace to come. But Clara had learned patience from the desert, and she worked methodically, rolling him onto the tarp first, then slowly maneuvering him into the wheelbarrow. He was heavier than she had expected, all muscle and bone, but unconsciousness made him pliant. The trip to the house required 3 rest stops, her lungs burning with exertion and her hands blistered from the rope. But she had carried heavier burdens, and the thought of his pulse fluttering against her fingers gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. Inside the house, she cleared the narrow daybed in what had once been Robert's study. The room faced north and stayed cool even in the heat of summer. She had sewn the quilt that covered the bed during the first winter of her marriage, her fingers learning the rhythm of hope, stitched into cotton and wool. Now she spread that same quilt over the unconscious Apache, smoothing the fabric with hands that shook only slightly. His fever had worsened during the journey, and she could see how the infection was beginning to claim him. There was no doctor within 50 miles, no one she could call for help, even if she had wanted to. She would have to trust her own knowledge, gathered from years of tending sick animals and nursing Robert through his final illness. She would have to trust that healing was a language older than the words that divided people, older than the fears that kept them apart. The man's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, dark and fever-bright, meeting hers with a gaze that seemed to look straight through to her soul. Then they closed again, and his breathing settled into the deep rhythm of the truly exhausted. Clara touched his forehead once more, feeling the heat that spoke of a body fighting for its life. Then she went to gather her supplies, her movements sure and purposeful. She had made her choice, and now she would see it through. Water was sacred in the desert, and Clara treated it as such as she drew it cool from the well and carried it to the bedside in Robert's favorite ceramic pitcher. The Apache man had been unconscious for 6 hours, his fever climbing despite her attempts to cool him with damp cloths. She had cleaned his wounds with the careful attention of someone who understood that healing was as much about intention as technique. The bullet graze on his shoulder was angry and inflamed, but not deep. It was the dehydration and exhaustion that threatened him most, the way his body had begun to consume itself in the absence of care. Clara dipped a clean cloth in the cool water and placed it on his forehead, watching the way his face relaxed slightly at the touch. His features were strong and well-defined, with crow's feet around his eyes that spoke of someone who smiled, often, and squinted at distant horizons. There was a scar along his jaw, old and white, and his hands were calloused in the way that came from working with wood and stone. She had found other things when she cleaned his wounds: a leather pouch around his neck containing what looked like dried herbs and small stones, a carved wooden flute tucked into his belt, objects that spoke of a life lived with reverence for the natural world, with attention to beauty, as well as survival. The afternoon stretched long and golden, and Clara found herself settling into the rhythm of care that she had almost forgotten. Every hour she changed the cool cloth on his forehead. Every 2 hours she dripped water between his lips, watching to make sure he swallowed reflexively. She cleaned his wounds again and applied the salve she made from aloe and honey, the same mixture she had used on Robert during his illness. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the man's fever finally broke. Clara felt the change in the quality of his breathing first, the way it deepened and became less labored. When she touched his forehead, the skin was warm, but no longer burning. His eyes opened just as the last light of day painted the room in shades of amber. For a moment he seemed confused, his gaze moving around the unfamiliar space before settling on her face. Clara saw the instant when awareness returned, the way his body tensed, ready for flight or fight. "You're safe," she said quietly, the first words she had spoken aloud in days. Her voice sounded rusty from disuse but gentle. "You were hurt. You're in my house." He studied her face with eyes that were dark as creek stones, taking in her grey-streaked hair and the lines that grief had etched around her mouth. She could see him cataloguing everything: the quilt, the room, the pitcher of water beside the bed. Looking for threats, for traps, for the catch that his experience had taught him always came with kindness from strangers. "Water," he said. Finally, the word barely more than a whisper. Clara lifted the pitcher and filled a glass, then helped him sit up enough to drink. He took small sips at first, then drank more deeply, as if remembering what thirst felt like only as it was being quenched. "Thank you," he said when he was finished, and Clara heard in those two words an accent that spoke of a language older than English, older than the settlements that had carved themselves into this ancient landscape. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, and she could see him weighing the risks of trust against the debt of gratitude. "Tao," he said finally. "My name is Tao." "I'm Clara." She settled back in the chair she had pulled beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Tao. That's a beautiful name." Something shifted in his expression, a surprise that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his name called beautiful by strangers, especially not by white strangers who found him bleeding on their land. "How long?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning. You've been fevering, but it broke a few hours ago." Clara poured more water into the glass. "You should rest. The infection is gone, but your body needs time to heal." Tao's eyes moved to the window, where the last light of day was fading into purple dusk. "I should go." "Where?" The question emerged more sharply than Clara had intended. "You can barely sit up. Where would you go in the middle of the night? Still weak from fever?" He didn't answer, but she could see the conflict playing across his features, the desire to stay and heal warring with the knowledge that his presence put them both at risk. "Stay tonight," Clara said, her voice gentling. "Tomorrow you can decide if you're strong enough to travel." Tao looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something she couldn't name. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and lay back against the pillows. "Thank you, Clara," he said again, and this time her name in his voice sounded like music. Morning came with the sound of wind chimes that Robert had hung from the porch rafters, their bronze voices singing of weather changes and the restless movements of air across vast spaces. Clara woke in her own bed for the first time in 2 days, having finally trusted that Tao's fever wouldn't return in the night. She padded barefoot to the kitchen and made coffee by habit, then poured a second cup and carried both to the study. Tao was awake, sitting up carefully against the pillows and looking out the window at the eastern mountains where the sun was beginning to paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "How do you feel?" she asked, offering him the coffee. "Stronger." He accepted the cup with both hands, and she noticed that his fingers were steady now, no longer trembling with fever and weakness. "The pain is less." Clara settled in the chair beside the bed, wrapping her hands around her own cup and breathing in the steam. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the desert wake up beyond the window. A roadrunner darted between the creosote bushes, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "So you live alone here?" Tao said eventually. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Clara sipped her coffee, tasting the bitter comfort of routine. 3 years now. Your husband?" "Died." The word came easier than it once had, worn smooth by repetition. "Heart attack. Quick and clean," the doctor said, as if that made it easier. Tao nodded with the understanding of someone who had experienced loss. "Mine too. My wife? Different sickness, same grief." Clara looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the wounded stranger she had rescued, but a fellow survivor of love's aftermath. "How long?" 5 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. They fell back into silence, but it was different now. Not the careful quiet of strangers, but the deeper peace of people who recognized something essential in each other. Clara found herself studying Tao's profile, the way the morning light caught the silver threads in his black hair, the careful way he held his injured shoulder. "Why were you running?" she asked finally. Tao was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of old injustices. There was trouble in town, a misunderstanding. He turned to look at her directly. A white man's horse went lame. I was nearby trying to trade for supplies. He decided I had spooked it deliberately. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She could picture the scene, the quick accusations, the escalating tension, the way fear could transform neighbors into enemies in the space of a heartbeat. "You didn't," she said. "No, but truth and belief are not always the same thing." Tao's fingers traced the edge of the quilt. His friends decided I needed to be taught a lesson. I chose to leave rather than fight. They shot you anyway. As I was leaving, yes. A warning, they said. Clara set down her coffee cup with careful control, her hands wanting to shake, with an anger she hadn't felt in years. "What was your trade?" Tao reached for the leather pouch around his neck, pulling it over his head and opening it carefully. From inside, he withdrew a small carved figurine, a horse in full gallop, its mane flowing like water, captured in wood with such skill that Clara could almost see it breathing. "I make these," he said simply. "Trade them for supplies, for food. This one was meant for the man's daughter." I had heard she loved horses. Clara took the carving when he offered it, feeling the smooth warmth of the wood and the incredible detail of the work. Every muscle was defined, every hair of the mane flowing in its proper direction. It was a work of art that spoke of patience and reverence, of hands that created beauty from raw material. "It's extraordinary," she said, meaning it. "My father taught me. His father taught him. It is our way of keeping the spirit of things alive." Clara handed the carving back, but Tao shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "Consider it payment for your care." "I don't need payment." "Then consider it a gift, the first I have given in many years." Clara closed her fingers around the wooden horse, feeling its warmth seep into her palm. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the morning in companionable quiet, Tao resting while Clara went about her daily routines. But she found herself moving, differently through her house, more aware of the sounds her feet made on the wooden floors, more conscious of the life that was happening in the room down the hall. It had been so long since she had shared her space with another person that she'd forgotten how much fuller a house could feel when it contained more than one heartbeat. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient to Clara. The careful attention to another person's needs, the sharing of meals and quiet conversation, the way her house seemed to expand to accommodate the presence of another soul. Tao was healing quickly, his natural strength reasserting itself as the infection faded and proper rest restored him. Clara watched him regain his vitality with the same attention she might pay to a wild animal learning to trust, carefully, without making sudden movements that might startle him back into wariness. On the 4th morning, she found him on the front porch, sitting in Robert's old rocking chair and watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of coral and gold. He had dressed in his own clothes, cleaned and mended as best she could manage, and there was something in his posture that spoke of a man preparing for departure. "You're leaving today," Clara said, settling into the chair beside him with her coffee. "Yes." Tao's voice was quiet, but certain. "I am strong enough now, and you have risked enough by helping me." Clara wanted to protest, to argue that he should stay longer, that 3 days wasn't enough time for his wounds to fully heal. But she understood the deeper truth, that his continued presence put them both in danger, and that he had already stayed longer than was wise. "Where will you go?" "North into the mountains. My people have camps there, places where I can rest fully and decide what comes next." Tao turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "You have given me my life, Clara. I will not forget." "You would have done the same for me. Perhaps, but you did not have to choose kindness. In these times between our peoples, kindness is rare." Clara thought of the townspeople who would be scandalized if they knew what she had done, of the neighbors who already whispered about the widow who lived alone in the desert. Fear had poisoned so many wells that it took courage just to offer water to a thirsty stranger. "I want to give you something," Tao said, reaching into his pouch and withdrawing a stone unlike any Clara had ever seen. It was smooth and warm, the color of dried blood, with veins of darker red running through it like captured lightning. "This is jasper, red jasper, very old, very sacred to my people." He placed the stone in Clara's palm, closing her fingers around it with both of his hands. "It is for protection, but also for courage, for the strength to make difficult choices and live with their consequences." Clara felt the weight of the stone, heavier than its size suggested, warm against her skin, as if it held its own source of heat. "I can't take this. It's too precious." "That is why you must take it." Tao's hands were still covering hers, and she could feel the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. "Sacred things are meant to be shared, not hoarded. And you have shown me that there are still people in this world who choose compassion over fear." Clara looked down at their joined hands, dark and pale intertwined, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was like the moment when a wound finally stops bleeding, not dramatic, but profound in its quiet certainty. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "The desert is large, but it has its own ways of bringing people together when they need to be together." Tao released her hands and stood, moving with the careful grace of someone still mindful of healing wounds. "Trust the stone, Clara. Trust what it tells you about your own heart." He gathered his few belongings, the leather pouch, the wooden flute, a small bundle of food Clara had prepared for his journey, and stepped down from the porch. At the bottom of the steps, he turned back to look at her. "Thank you," he said. Again, and Clara heard in those words all the things that couldn't be spoken: gratitude, blessing, the recognition of something sacred that had passed between them. Then he was walking away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape, until he seemed to merge with the desert itself. Clara stood on the porch until she could no longer distinguish his form from the shadows of the distant mountains, the red jasper warm in her palm like a second heartbeat. When she finally went back inside, the house felt different, not empty, but expectant, as if it were waiting for something to begin. The red jasper became Clara's constant companion in the days that followed Tao's departure. She carried it in her pocket as she went about her daily routines, her thumb finding its smooth surface whenever uncertainty crept into her thoughts. The stone seemed to pulse with its own warmth, a reminder of the choice she had made, and the man whose life had intersected with hers for those precious few days. But it was more than memory that the jasper awakened. Clara found herself paying attention to things she had long ignored: the movement of birds across the sky, the way shadows fell across her land at different times of day, the subtle changes in the wind that spoke of weather patterns and seasonal shifts. She began to understand what Tao had meant about the desert having its own ways. Everything was connected in ways she had never noticed before. Threads of relationship and interdependence woven so tightly that pulling one strand affected the entire fabric. The realization came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over the Yei. Mountains. She had been living on this land for 15 years, but she had never truly seen it. Robert had taught her the practical things: how to maintain the well, how to mend fence line, how to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil. But Tao, in just 3 days, had shown her something deeper. The land was not something to be conquered or controlled. It was something to be listened to, learned from, partnered with in the ancient dance of survival and mutual care. Clara began to notice the places where water gathered after the rare rains, the rocky outcroppings that provided shelter for small animals, the hardy plants that seemed to thrive in the harshest conditions. She watched the way the Apache plume bloomed in impossible places, drawing life from what appeared to be barren stone. One morning, while checking the fence line, she discovered something that made her heart race. Fresh horse tracks, but not the kind made by the iron shoes favored by the townspeople. These were unshod prints, accompanied by the soft impressions of moccasins in the dust. Apache tracks. Clara followed them with growing excitement, her hand instinctively moving to the jasper in her pocket. The trail led to a place where the fence had been recently repaired, not with the crude patches she usually managed, but with careful attention to both function and beauty. New wire had been woven through the existing mesh with such skill that it was almost invisible, and a loose post had been reset with stones arranged in a pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward the distant mountains. At the base of the repaired post, partially hidden beneath a small pile of carefully arranged stones, Clara found a bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a collection of dried herbs she didn't recognize, their scent both medicinal and spiritual, and a small piece of bark with symbols carved into its surface. Clara couldn't read the symbols, but she understood their meaning in the way that hearts understand things minds cannot translate. They were a message of gratitude, a blessing, a promise that the help she had given would be remembered and honored. But they were something else too, an invitation, an acknowledgement that the boundaries between peoples need not be absolute, that there were ways to communicate across the spaces that fear had created between communities. That evening, Clara sat on her porch with the jasper, warm in one hand, and the piece of carved bark in the other, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt the stirring of something beyond mere survival, purpose, direction, the sense that her life might have meaning beyond the careful maintenance of her own small corner of the world. The jasper pulsed against her palm, and Clara closed her eyes, listening to the night sounds of the desert with new ears. Somewhere out there, Tao was probably sitting by his own fire, perhaps carving another horse or teaching a young person the art of seeing beauty in raw wood. Somewhere out there, his people were living lives shaped by wisdom she was only beginning to glimpse. And here, in the space between worlds, Clara McCallan was discovering that healing wasn't just something you offered to strangers who arrived wounded at your doorstep. Sometimes it was something you chose for yourself, one careful decision at a time. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Clara breathed it in and felt for the first time in years, genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. The first sign of trouble came with the dust cloud that appeared on the eastern horizon 3 weeks after Tao's departure. Clara was tending her small vegetable garden, coaxing tomatoes and squash from the reluctant earth, when the sound of multiple horses reached her ears. She straightened slowly, her hand moving automatically to the jasper in her pocket, and watched as a group of riders approached her property. Even from a distance, she could see the purposeful way they moved, the kind of organized formation that spoke of official business rather than neighborly visits. 5 men, she counted as they drew closer. She recognized 2 of them, Sheriff Morrison from Mesquite Flats and Bill Henderson, who owned the largest ranch in the valley. The other 3 were strangers, their clothes too clean and their horses too fine for men who made their living from the land. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the front porch, her steps measured and calm despite the quickening of her pulse. She had learned from Robert that appearing nervous in front of men with power only gave them ideas about what they might demand from you. "Afternoon, Clara," Sheriff Morrison called as the group approached. He was a decent man overall, she knew, but one who had always been more concerned with keeping peace than ensuring justice. "Mind if we water our horses? Long ride from town." "Of course," Clara gestured toward the well. "Help yourselves." She waited while they attended to their animals, noting the way the 3 strangers examined her property with calculating eyes. They had the look of men who saw land in terms of profit rather than home, who could calculate the value of water rights and mineral claims with the same detachment they might apply to any other commodity. Clara McCallan, the tallest of the strangers, stepped forward, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone from back east. "I'm James Whitfield, representing the Territorial Mining Consortium. We understand you own 40 acres here." "I do." Clara kept her voice level, though her instincts were already screaming warnings. "Excellent property. We're conducting a survey of the region, assessing potential for mineral extraction, copper, silver, possibly gold. Very promising geology. In this area." Clara felt the jasper grow warm in her pocket, as if responding to some unseen danger. "I'm not interested in selling." Whitfield smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Oh, we're not looking to buy individual properties, Mrs. McCallan. This kind of operation requires a much larger scale. Eminent domain, you understand, for the greater good of territorial development." The words hit Clara like cold water. Eminent domain, the legal theft that had driven so many small ranchers from their homes, justified by the promise of progress, and prosperity that never seemed to benefit the people who lost their land. "This is my home," she said quietly. "Of course, and you'll be fairly compensated. The territorial government is very committed to treating displaced residents with complete fairness." Whitfield's smile widened. "Though I should mention, the process goes much more smoothly when property owners cooperate voluntarily." Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Jim, there's no need for threats. Mrs. McCallan here has always been a law-abiding citizen." "No threats at all, Sheriff, just explaining how things work." Whitfield turned back to Clara. "The survey will be completed within the month. I expect we'll have the paperwork filed shortly after that. Just wanted to give you time to make arrangements." Clara looked at the 5 men arrayed before her property, at the casual confidence with which they discussed uprooting her life, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced when she found Tao bleeding by her fence, the moment when choice became unavoidable. "How much land are we talking about?" she asked. "The entire valley, eventually. About 12,000 acres in total." Whitfield consulted a paper from his saddlebag. 15 property owners, including several Apache claims to the north. Apache claims. Clara's hand tightened on the jasper, and she thought of the careful way Tao had repaired her fence, the symbols he had carved into bark, the message of connection and mutual care. Those claims are recognized by the territorial government. Well, that's a complex legal question, but generally speaking, mining operations take precedence over traditional usage rights. Progress, you understand. Clara understood perfectly. She understood that progress was a word men like Whitfield used when they wanted to take something that didn't belong to them. She understood that 12,000 acres of irreplaceable desert would be strip-mined and poisoned in the name of profit. She understood that her small house, with its memories and carefully tended garden, would be bulldozed to make way for machinery that would extract wealth for men who had never felt the desert wind in their faces. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Of course. But don't think too long, Mrs. McCallan. These things have a way of proceeding whether individual landowners are ready or not." Whitfield tipped his hat. "Good day." Clara watched them ride away, their dust cloud growing smaller against the vast horizon. When they were finally gone, she sat down heavily on her porch steps and pulled the jasper from her pocket. The stone was warm, almost hot, and as she held it in her palm, Clara could swear she heard Tao's voice carried on the wind. "Trust what it tells you about your own heart." Her heart was telling her that some things were worth fighting for, even when you didn't know how to fight. Some things were too sacred to surrender without struggle. The desert stretched away from her in all directions, ancient and patient and indifferent to human schemes. But Clara was no longer indifferent. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt the stirring of something larger than grief. She felt the awakening of rage. Sleep eluded Clara that night. She paced her house like a caged animal, her mind racing through possibilities and plans, none of which seemed adequate to the magnitude of what she faced. How did one woman with 40 acres stand against territorial mining interests and government backing? But as the hours wore on, and the jasper grew warm in her restless hands, another question began to surface. What if she wasn't standing alone? At dawn, Clara saddled her mare and rode north toward the mountains, following the faint trails that Tao had shown her during his recovery. She had never ventured this far from her property before, but the jasper seemed to pulse with its own sense of direction, guiding her up rocky paths and through narrow canyons she would never have attempted on her own. The sun was high overhead when she caught the scent of smoke and heard the distant sound of voices. Following the wind-carried sounds, she crested a small ridge and found herself looking down into a hidden valley where a camp sprawled between towering red rocks. Apache wickiups dotted the canyon floor, their brush and hide coverings blending so seamlessly with the landscape that Clara might have missed them entirely, if not for the thin threads of smoke rising from cook fires. Children played between the shelters, while women worked at tasks Clara couldn't identify from her distance. Men sat in small groups, their voices a low murmur that spoke of serious conversation. Clara dismounted and stood at the ridge edge, uncertain how to proceed. She had come this far on instinct and desperation, But now she realized she had no plan beyond the vague hope of finding Tao and somehow convincing him to help her understand what 12,000 acres of mining claims might mean to his people. A child's voice called out below, high and excited, and Clara saw heads turning in her direction. Within moments, several men were climbing the rocky path toward her position, moving with the fluid grace of people who belonged to this landscape in ways she never could. Tao was among them, and Clara felt her heart lift at the sight of his familiar face. But there was something different in his expression now, a wariness that hadn't been there when she tended his wounds in her house. Clara. He reached the ridge first, his breathing easy despite the climb. You are far from home. I need to speak with you, with your people. Clara gestured toward the valley below. There's trouble coming. Mining claims. The whole valley. Tao studied her face, and Clara could see him weighing her words against the risk of trusting a white woman with knowledge of his people's location. After a long moment, he nodded. Come down, but slowly and with your hands visible. My brothers do not know you as I do. The descent into the hidden valley felt like traveling backward through time. Clara was acutely aware of the eyes watching, her of children peering out from behind their mother's skirts, of conversations stopping as she passed. But Tao walked beside her with quiet confidence, and gradually the tension around them began to ease. He led her to a circle of elders seated in the shade of a massive boulder, their weathered faces mapped with lines that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. Clara felt like an intruder in this sacred space, but when Tao spoke to them in rapid Apache, gesturing toward her, and the jasper she now held openly in her palm, she saw recognition and acceptance dawn in their eyes. They know of you, Tao said quietly. The woman who offers water instead of bullets. Your kindness has been spoken of in our camps. An elderly woman with silver hair braided down her back spoke in Apache, her voice melodic and strong. Tao listened intently, then turned to Clara. She says the red jasper chose you, and that makes you sister to our people. She asks what trouble brings you to our hidden places. Clara found herself speaking directly to the silver-haired woman, even though she knew the words would need Tao's translation. Men came to my house yesterday, mining companies with government backing. They plan to claim the entire valley, your lands and mine. They want to tear it apart looking for copper and silver. As Tao translated, Clara watched the faces around the circle grow grave. These people had seen mining operations before, had watched sacred places destroyed and water sources poisoned in the name of progress. They understood what was coming in ways that went beyond her own fears. The silver-haired woman spoke again, her words flowing like water over stone. When she finished, she reached out and touched Clara's hand where it held the jasper. She says the earth has been crying for protection, and that you have come as an answer to those cries, Tao translated. She says there is an old prophecy about a time when the people would find allies among those who had been enemies, when old wounds would heal in the face of a greater threat. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to fight something this big. I'm just one woman, with a small ranch. No, said another voice, and Clara turned to see a man she hadn't noticed before approaching the circle. He was younger than the elders, but carried himself with unmistakable authority. You are not just one woman. You are a woman who chose compassion over fear, who risked her own safety to help a stranger. That makes you dangerous to men who depend on fear to control others. Tao stood and clasped the newcomer's shoulder. Clara, this is my cousin Joseph. He speaks English well, and he has been to the territorial capital. He understands the legal ways of the white world. Joseph settled into the circle, his dark eyes serious. The mining consortium has money and political connections, but they do not have the law completely on their side. If the Apache claims and the individual property owners were to unite, to speak with one voice, it could work? Clara felt a spark of hope. It would be difficult. It would require trust between peoples who have been taught to hate each other. It would require courage from those who have learned that safety comes from staying quiet and invisible. Joseph looked directly at Clara. But yes, it could work. The silver-haired woman spoke again, and this time her words needed no translation. Clara heard in them the same resolve that had driven her to ride into these mountains. the same determination that had made her choose healing over fear when she found Tao bleeding by her fence. "She says the earth is calling for its protectors to stand together," Tao said softly. "She says it is time for the red jasper to do its work." The plan that emerged from that first meeting in the hidden valley was audacious in its simplicity. Bring together all the landowners who would be affected by the mining claims and convince them to make common cause with the Apache bands who had traditional rights to the northern reaches of the valley. But as Clara rode back to her ranch that evening, the jasper warm in her pocket and her mind racing with possibilities, she understood that the real challenge would be overcoming decades of mistrust and prejudice that had poisoned relationships between the communities. She started with what she knew best, the practical concerns of people trying to make a living from difficult land. Over the next week, Clara rode from ranch to ranch, carrying maps that Joseph had drawn and questions that cut straight to the heart of survival. "What happens to your cattle when the water table drops from all that mining?" she asked Bill Henderson, who controlled more acreage than any other single owner in the valley. "Where do you think your children will go when there's no land left to inherit?" She pressed Martha Williams, whose family had been homesteading their 160 acres for 3 generations. "Do you really trust territorial politicians to pay fair prices for what your grandfather died building?" She challenged old Pete Morrison, the sheriff's father, whose arthritic hands still bore the scars of 40 years spent wrestling a living from stubborn earth. The responses were mixed, colored by fear and skepticism, and the bone-deep wariness of people who had learned not to trust promises that seemed too good to be true. But Clara persisted, returning again and again with new information from Joseph about legal precedents and territorial law, with maps that showed exactly how much water the mining operations would consume, with stories about other valleys that had been strip-mined and abandoned. "You're asking us to throw in with Apache," Bill Henderson said bluntly during their third conversation, his weathered face creased with doubt. "My father fought them, lost a brother to a raid in '67. And my husband's family lost their oldest son to a cavalry charge that same year," Clara replied quietly. "But that was 20 years ago, Bill. The men who want to destroy this valley, they're not interested in fighting old wars. They just want our land, all of our land." Slowly, painfully, Clara began to see cracks in the wall of resistance. Pete Morrison was the first to publicly agree to attend a meeting with the Apache representatives. Martha Williams followed a day later, driven by the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had watched her children learn to love this harsh landscape. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel Santos arrived at Clara's ranch on a Tuesday morning, his ancient truck wheezing and smoking as it navigated the rutted road to her house. The Catholic priest had served both the Mexican families in the valley and the few Apache who had converted to his faith, and his presence at any meeting would lend legitimacy to the alliance Clara was trying to build. "I have been hearing interesting stories about you, Clara McCallan," he said as she poured him coffee on her front porch. His English carried the musical accent of his native Spanish, and his eyes held the quiet humor of someone who had seen enough of human nature to find it more amusing than shocking. "I imagine you have. They say you sheltered an Apache man, nursed him back to health when you could have turned him away or handed him over to the sheriff." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Would you have turned him away, Father?" Father Miguel laughed, a sound like warm honey. "You answer a question with a question. Very wise. But no, I would not have turned him away. And I think perhaps that is why God has brought this crisis to our valley, to see who among us remembers that we are all children of the same Creator. Will you help us?" "I am already helping. I have spoken to the territorial bishop about the mining claims. The church has its own concerns about operations that would destroy sacred sites, ours and theirs." Father Miguel sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But more than that, I have agreed to host the first meeting. Neutral ground, you understand. The mission has always been a place where all peoples could come for sanctuary." Clara felt the jasper pulse in her pocket, warm and reassuring. "When?" "Tomorrow night. I have already sent word to Joseph and to the ranchers who have agreed to listen, whether they come or not." Father Miguel shrugged eloquently. "That is between them and their consciences." The next evening, Clara arrived at the old mission, just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. The adobe building stood weathered and solid against the landscape, its bell tower reaching toward the first stars like a prayer made manifest in stone and timber. Inside, Clara was amazed to see nearly 30 people gathered in the simple sanctuary. Ranch families she recognized mixed with Apache representatives, their children playing together in the back pews, while the adults maintained careful distances that spoke of old habits and older fears. But they had come. Despite generations of suspicion and conflict, despite the risks of being seen as traitors to their own kinds, they had come. Father Miguel stood at the simple altar, his brown robe marking him as a man who belonged to no particular tribe save that of faith. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed space, "we gather tonight not as enemies, but as neighbors who share the same earth and drink from the same sky." Joseph rose from his seat near the front, and Clara felt her heart swell with pride at the dignity with which he carried himself. "The earth does not recognize the boundaries we draw on our maps," he said, his English clear and strong. "When the mining machines poison the water, Apache children and white children will thirst together. When they strip away the soil, all our crops will fail equally." Old Pete Morrison stood up slowly, his arthritic joints protesting. "My family's been on this land for 30 years, fought for it, bled for it, buried kin in it. I'll be damned if I'm going to let some territorial politicians and their Eastern money steal it from under us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, and Clara felt something shift in the atmosphere of the room. The careful distances began to collapse as people moved closer together, ranchers and Apache finding themselves seated side by side, united by the common threat to everything they held sacred. Father Miguel smiled from his place at the altar. "It seems," he said quietly, "that God has a sense of humor about how he chooses to answer prayers." The coalition that emerged from that first meeting at the mission was unlike anything the territorial government had faced before. Within 2 weeks, they had elected Clara as their official spokesperson, a choice that surprised no one more than Clara herself. "Why me?" she asked Joseph, as they worked together to draft their formal response to the mining consortium's claims. "Because you are the bridge," he replied, not looking up from the legal documents spread across her kitchen table. "The Apache trust you because you showed kindness to Tao. The ranchers trust you because you are one of them, but also because you are not trying to profit from this fight." Father Miguel, who had become an unofficial advisor to their cause, nodded from his seat by the window. "And because you are a woman who has lost much and yet chooses hope over bitterness, people recognize authenticity, Clara. It is rarer than we would like to think." The jasper had become Clara's touchstone during the long hours of planning and preparation. She carried it everywhere now, its warmth a constant reminder of the choice she had made when she found Tao bleeding by her fence. Sometimes, when the legal complexities threatened to overwhelm her, she would close her eyes and remember the moment when he had placed the stone in her palm, his words about courage and difficult choices echoing in her memory. Their first major victory came when the Territorial Attorney General agreed to review their petition. Joseph's research had uncovered precedents for indigenous land rights that the mining consortium had hoped to ignore, while Father Miguel's contacts in the territorial capital provided political pressure from unexpected quarters. But it was Clara's testimony at the hearing that proved most effective. "Gentlemen," she said, standing before the panel of territorial officials in their imposing chamber, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance, "you see before you a coalition that 3 months ago would have been impossible. Apache and ranchers, Catholics and Protestants, families who have been neighbors for decades, and others who are meeting for the first time." She paused, letting her gaze move across the faces of the men who would decide the fate of her valley. "We have come together not because we agree on everything, but because we agree on this. The land we love is worth more than the minerals beneath it. The water we depend on is worth more than the profits it might generate. The communities we have built are worth more than the wealth that destroying them might create." James Whitfield and his legal team sat at the opposing table, their expensive suits and briefcases a stark contrast to the simple clothes worn by Clara's coalition. But for the first time since this fight began, Clara saw uncertainty in Whitfield's eyes. "Mrs. McAllen," the chief territorial judge said when she finished, "you understand that mining operations bring jobs and economic development to regions that badly need both? Your Honor, I understand that some forms of prosperity come at too high a price." Clara pulled the jasper from her pocket, holding it where the judge could see its deep red glow. "This stone is jasper, sacred to the Apache people, and older than any of the claims being made on our land. It was given to me as a symbol of protection and courage, not just for myself, but for everything that depends on the health of the desert." She placed the jasper on the witness table. "The mining consortium asks you to see our valley as a resource to be extracted. We ask you to see it as a home to be protected. The choice you make here will determine not just our future, but the kind of territory, the kind of people we choose to become." The hearing continued for 3 more days, with testimony from hydrologists about water table impacts, from historians about the cultural significance of sites that would be destroyed, from economists about the long-term costs of environmental damage. But Clara knew that the real decision had been made in that moment, when she placed the jasper on the table and spoke about the kind of people they chose to become. The territorial judge's ruling, when it came 2 weeks later, was narrow, but decisive. The mining claims were denied based on insufficient environmental impact assessment and failure to properly consult with affected indigenous communities. But more importantly, the coalition that had formed to fight the mining threat didn't dissolve once victory was achieved. The connections forged in crisis had revealed possibilities that none of them had imagined before, ways of sharing resources, and knowledge that benefited everyone, ways of resolving conflicts that didn't require choosing sides. Clara found herself at the center of something larger than she had ever dreamed of when she first carried water to a wounded stranger. The jasper had done its work, not just in protecting what they loved, but in transforming them into the kind of people who could build something new from the ashes of old hatreds. Standing on her porch that evening, watching the sun set over land that would remain unmarked by mining machinery, Clara felt the desert wind carry with it the voices of children playing, Apache and white and Mexican children who might grow up seeing each other as neighbors rather than enemies. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of miracle that happened when people chose courage over fear, one small decision at a time. 5 years after the mining claims were defeated, the collection of ranches and Apache camps had evolved into something that had no name in any single language. It was Tao who finally suggested calling it Solatiladu, an Apache word that meant where different waters flow together to become one stream. Clara stood at the edge of what had once been her isolated 40 acres and marveled at how the landscape had transformed while remaining fundamentally itself. The mission still stood at the heart of the community, but now it was surrounded by a network of paths that connected Apache wiki-ups with ranch houses, a school where children learned in both English and Apache, and a trading post where Tao's carved horses sat beside Martha Williams' pottery and Pete Morrison's leatherwork. The changes had come gradually, organically, like desert plants that find ways to share scarce water and create microclimates where more fragile species can thrive. When drought threatened the valley 2 years after the mining victory, the Apache, knowledge of hidden springs and water conservation, had saved both the rancher's cattle and the community's hopes for the future. When Apache children showed interest in reading and writing English, Clara had volunteered to teach them, while Joseph and his grandmother shared stories and traditional knowledge with the rancher children who hung on their every word about tracking animals and reading weather signs. "You have started something remarkable here," Father Miguel said, joining Clara on the rise where she often came to watch the sunset. His hair was grayer now, and he moved more slowly, but his eyes still held the same quiet humor that had made him such an effective mediator in those early, difficult days. "I didn't start anything," Clara replied, her hand moving automatically to the jasper that still rode in her pocket. "I just said yes when the moment came." "Ah, but that is everything, is it not? The willingness to say yes when the universe asks if you are ready to grow beyond what you thought possible." Below them, the community was settling into its evening rhythms. Smoke rose from cook fires both in the Apache camps and the ranch houses, and the sound of children's laughter drifted up on the cooling air. Clara could see Tao teaching a group of young people how to work with wood, his patient hands guiding. Theirs as they learned to see the spirit hidden inside raw material. "Do you think it will last?" Clara asked. "After we're gone, I mean. After the people who remember why this matters are no longer here to tell the stories?" Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "I think," he said finally, "that you have planted seeds that will grow in ways you cannot imagine. The children playing down there, they will never know a world where Apache and white are automatically enemies. They will never understand why their grandparents were afraid of people who are simply their neighbors." Clara nodded, but she felt the weight of impermanence that comes with age and the knowledge that all human endeavors are fragile. "I worry about what happens if people forget, if they start to take this for granted. Then you must make sure they do not forget." Father Miguel turned to look at her directly. "You must write it down, Clara. The whole story. How it began, how it grew, what it means. Leave them a record of what is possible when people choose hope over fear." That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a blank journal open before her. For a long time she simply held the jasper and listened to the night sounds of the desert, coyotes calling to each other across vast distances, the whisper of wind through sage and palo verde, the soft murmur of voices from the camps and houses scattered across the valley. Then she began to write. The story of Solatiladu begins with water offered to a thirsty stranger, and with the understanding that kindness is a choice we make not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. This community exists because people decided that their children's future was more important than their parents' fears. She wrote through the night and into the dawn, her pen moving across the pages with steady purpose. She wrote about Tao's arrival and the decision that had changed everything. She wrote about the mining threat and the unlikely alliance that had defeated it. She wrote about the slow, patient work of building trust between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. But mostly, she wrote about the small moments that had accumulated into transformation. The first time an Apache child had played with a rancher's daughter, the first time Joseph had been invited to share a meal at Bill Henderson's table, the first time Clara had heard her own language mixed with Apache words spoken by children who saw no contradiction in being fluent in both. As the sun rose over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, Clara looked up from her writing to see Tao approaching her house. He moved with the same quiet grace he had possessed even when wounded. But there was something different about him now, a contentment that spoke of a man who had found his place in the world. "You did not sleep," he observed, settling onto the porch steps beside her chair. "I was writing about this place, about what we've built here." Clara gestured toward the valley where their community was beginning to stir with the day's activities. "Trying to capture it before it changes too much to remember." Tao nodded thoughtfully. "Stories are important. They carry the spirit of things across time, the way water carries seeds across the desert. Do you think we've done something good here, Tao? Or are we just fooling ourselves into thinking we've solved problems that can't really be solved?" Tao was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the landscape they had all worked to protect and nurture. "I think," he said finally, "that we have shown it is possible for the waters to flow together. Whether they continue to flow depends on the choices that come after us." Clara closed the journal and stood, stretching muscles that ached from the long night of writing. "Then I suppose we'd better make sure those choices are good ones." "Yes," Tao agreed, rising to stand beside her. "And I think the red jasper chose its guardian well." 10 years had passed since Clara first put pen to paper to record the story of Solatiladu, and the journal had grown into something far more ambitious, a comprehensive record of the community's evolution, maintained not just by Clara, but by rotating teams of residents who took turns documenting the small victories and daily miracles that defined their shared life. The Book of Solatiladu, as it came to be known, lived in the mission's library, but copies of individual stories circulated throughout the community. Children learned to read from tales of their own neighbors' courage. Adults found inspiration in accounts of problems solved through cooperation rather than conflict. Clara, now in her late 60s with silver threading through her hair and lines mapping her face like the dry washes that marked the desert floor, had become the community's unofficial keeper of memory. But she was no longer the sole voice telling their story. Apache elders contributed chapters about traditional knowledge and seasonal ceremonies. Mexican families added accounts of celebrations that blended cultures in ways that honored all traditions. Even the children wrote entries about what it meant to grow up in a place where difference was celebrated rather than feared. "Read us," the part about the first school, 8-year-old Maria Santos requested one evening as Clara sat surrounded by children in the mission's main hall. It was story time, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally from the community's need to pass on its founding values to the generation that would inherit them. Clara opened the book to a chapter she had written 3 years earlier, about the delicate negotiations that had led to the establishment of Solatiladu's bilingual school. "The problem," she read aloud, her voice carrying easily through the hushed room, was not that the children couldn't learn in 2 languages. The problem was that the adults couldn't imagine what such learning might create. The children leaned forward, even though most of them had heard this story dozens of times. Clara continued reading about the fears that had nearly derailed the school project. Apache parents worried that English education would steal their children's souls. Rancher families convinced that Apache children would corrupt their own offspring with savage ideas. But then something wonderful happened, Clara read, and the children joined their voices to hers for the familiar refrain. They decided to try it for 1 month and see what happened. "And what happened?" prompted little James Henderson, even though he knew the answer by heart. "The children taught their parents that wisdom has many forms and that speaking 2 languages doesn't divide your heart, it doubles it." After the children were sent to bed, Clara remained in the mission hall, the book of Solatiladu open in her lap as she worked on a new entry. This one was more personal, about the changes she felt in herself as age began to reshape her body and her perspective on time. "I understand now that the red jasper didn't choose me because I was especially brave or wise. It chose me because I was ready to be changed by the choices I made. Every act of kindness, every decision to trust instead of fear, every moment when I chose connection over isolation, they all added up to a life I never could have imagined when I was just a widow trying to survive alone in the desert." Footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and Clara looked up to see Joseph approaching. He was middle-aged now, his dark hair showing silver at the temples, but he still carried himself with the dignity that had impressed her from their first meeting. "Writing again?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "Always. The stories keep coming, and someone needs to catch them before they fly away." Clara closed the book carefully. "How was the council meeting?" "Productive. We've received another request from territorial officials. They want to bring a delegation here to study what we've accomplished. Apparently, word of Solatiladu has reached the capital." Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Recognition brought its own dangers, the risk that outsiders would try to copy their methods without understanding the spirit that made them work. What did the council decide? To invite them, but with conditions. They come as students, not experts. They listen more than they talk, and they understand that what we've built here can't be replicated, only adapted to other places. Other circumstances. Clara nodded approvingly. The community had learned to be protective of what they had created, while remaining open to sharing its lessons with others who were genuinely seeking to heal old wounds and build new bridges. "There's something else," Joseph said, his tone becoming more serious. "The delegation specifically asked to meet with you. They've heard about the woman who started it all by offering water to a wounded Apache." "I didn't start anything," Clara protested automatically. "I just made a choice." "Yes," Joseph smiled, "and that choice rippled outward until it changed. Everything. That's exactly what they want to understand." Clara looked around the mission hall, with its simple beauty and the sense of peace that seemed to radiate from its adobe walls. Tomorrow, children who were both Apache and white, Mexican and Anglo, would gather here to learn from teachers who drew on all traditions to help them understand the world they were inheriting. "All right," she said finally. "I'll meet with them. But they need to understand that the real story isn't about me. It's about all of us. about what happens when people decide that their shared future is more important than their separate pasts. "I think," Joseph said quietly, "that's exactly what they need to hear." Clara's 70th birthday arrived, with the turning of another season, marked not by sadness for the years behind her, but by gratitude for the time she had been given to see Solatiladu grow from desperate alliance into thriving community. The celebration itself embodied everything the settlement had become: Apache drumming blended with Spanish guitars, traditional foods shared alongside ranch-style barbecue, children who switched seamlessly between languages as they played games that drew from all their cultures. Standing on the mission steps as the sun set over the valley that had become home to nearly 300 people, Clara felt the weight of time and change. Her body moved more slowly now, and she relied on a walking stick carved by Tao from desert ironwood. But her mind remained sharp, and her heart had only grown larger with the accumulation of love that came from watching children become adults, conflicts become friendships, and dreams become reality. "Speech!" called out Martha Williams, now in her 60s but still possessed of the boundless energy that had made her such an effective advocate for the community school. "Clara has to give us a speech." The crowd took up the cry, and Clara found herself reluctantly climbing the mission steps to address the gathered community. From this vantage point, she could see the full scope of what they had built together: the network of paths connecting homes and workshops, the gardens where desert-adapted crops fed both bodies and souls, the children's playground where swings hung from the branches of cottonwood trees that drew their water from the carefully managed acequia system Joseph had designed. "My friends," Clara began, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "when I was a young woman, I thought courage meant facing danger without fear. I thought wisdom meant having all the answers. I thought strength meant never needing help from anyone." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Clara smiled at the recognition in their faces. "Living here with all of you has taught me that courage means acting with kindness even when you're afraid. Wisdom means knowing which questions to ask, and strength means being brave enough to accept help when it's offered, and wise enough to offer it when it's needed." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the red jasper, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, but still warm with its own inner fire. "This stone was given to me 20 years ago by a man who trusted me with his life when he had no reason to believe I deserved that trust. It was meant to remind me that protection comes not from walls we build around ourselves, but from connections we forge with others." Clara held the jasper high enough for everyone to see, its deep red catching the last light of day. "Tonight I want to pass this stone to someone else, not because my time with it is over, but because its work here has grown beyond what any one person can carry." A hush fell over the gathering as Clara descended the steps and walked slowly through the crowd. People parted before her, sensing the solemnity of the moment. She stopped in front of the community school, where a group of teenage students stood together, Apache and Anglo and Mexican, their faces reflecting the blended heritage that was becoming Solatiladu's greatest gift to the future. "Elena," Clara said, addressing a 16-year-old girl whose Apache grandmother had been one of the original skeptics about the alliance, but whose white father had thrown himself into learning traditional farming techniques with the enthusiasm of a convert. "Will you accept the responsibility of the red jasper?" Elena's eyes widened, and Clara could see the weight of the honor settling on her young shoulders. What am I supposed to do with it?" "Trust it," Clara said simply, placing the warm stone in Elena's palm and closing her fingers around it. "Trust what it tells you about making difficult choices and living with their consequences. Trust what it teaches you about the courage that comes from compassion." Elena nodded solemnly, her fingers tightening around the jasper. Around them, the community watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing the formal passage of something precious from one generation to the next. "But remember," Clara added, her voice growing stronger, "the real power was never in the stone. It was in what the stone helped us remember about ourselves, that we are capable of more love, more courage, more wisdom than we ever imagined. That we can choose to see enemies as potential friends, strangers as future family, problems as opportunities to grow. The celebration continued long into the night, but Clara slipped away as the moon rose full and bright over the desert. She walked slowly along the familiar paths, her ironwood walking stick tapping against the packed earth, visiting all the places that held her deepest memories. The spot where she had found Tao, now marked by a small shrine that community members had built to honor the moment when everything changed. The mission where impossible alliances had been forged in the crucible of shared purpose. The school where children learned that difference was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. Finally, she made her way to her own house, still, standing on the original 40 acres but no longer isolated. Other homes had grown up around it, connected by the informal network of relationships that made Suscríbete a community rather than just a collection of neighbors. On her front porch, Clara settled into Robert's old rocking chair and looked out over the valley that had become something she never could have imagined when she first offered water to a wounded stranger. The jasper was gone from her pocket, but she could still feel its warmth, as if 2 decades of carrying it had infused her own hands with its power to heal and protect. A figure moved through the shadows, and Clara smiled as Tao emerged into the moonlight. He was older now, his hair completely silver, but he still moved with the grace that had marked him even when wounded. He had never married again, choosing instead to dedicate his life to teaching the traditional skills that kept Apache culture alive, while adapting to the new world his people were creating alongside their former enemies. "How does it feel?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers, "to let go of something you've carried so long?" "Like breathing out after holding your breath for 20 years, Clara said. "Like planting a seed and finally being able to trust that it will grow without your constant attention." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the night sky reveal its ancient patterns of stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound was answered by others until the desert rang with their wild music. "Do you think Eleanor will understand what she's been given?" Tao asked. "She'll learn. The same way I learned, the same way we all learn. By making choices and living with their consequences, by trusting that love is stronger than fear, even when fear seems more reasonable." Clara reached over and took Tao's hand, feeling the familiar calluses and scars that spoke of a life spent creating beauty from raw materials. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me with your life when you had every reason not to, for showing me that healing is possible even between peoples who have been taught to hate each other." "Thank you," Tao replied, "for proving that there are still people in this world who choose compassion over fear, who believe that enemies can become family if someone is brave enough to offer water instead of bullets." The moon climbed higher, washing the desert in silver light, and Clara felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you have lived a life that mattered. Tomorrow, Eleanor would begin her own journey with the red jasper, making her own choices about courage and kindness and the connections that bind communities together. And in the book of Suscríbete, new stories would be written by new voices, each chapter adding to the record of what was possible when people chose hope over fear, trust over suspicion, love over hate. The desert wind carried with it the scent of blooming nightshade and the promise of rain, and Clara McCallan closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her own heart beating in rhythm with the vast, patient pulse of the land she had learned to call home. In her final entry in the book of Suscríbete, written just before her death 5 years later, Clara would record these words: "The red jasper taught me that healing begins with a single choice to see the humanity in those we have been taught to fear. But the miracle of Suscríbete taught me something even more profound, that such choices, made with courage and sustained with love, can transform not just individuals, but entire communities, creating legacies that outlive those who first chose to believe in impossible things." The woman who had offered water instead of bullets had indeed changed a desert forever. But more than that, she had proved that the power to change the world lies not in grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose one moment at a time to love more than they fear.